I am 70 years old, and lately, I struggle to sleep. Not because of my age, though my joints ache in the morning and my back protests when I rise from my chair. Not because of illness, though the doctors have given me their warnings and their prescriptions. No, I lie awake because of the memories. They come to me in the quiet hours before dawn, uninvited and relentless, like waves against a shore that has already eroded too much. I have spent my entire life serving as a Jehovah's Witness. Every decision I made, every choice I considered, every relationship I cultivated was filtered through that identity. I was a pioneer, dedicating countless hours to door-to-door ministry. I was an elder, standing before congregations with authority I believed came from God Himself. I was a faithful husband, or at least I tried to be, keeping my marriage within the boundaries prescribed by the organization. I was a dedicated father, raising my children according to the principles I was taught were infallible. Or at least, that's what I believed I was. But when a man reaches the end of his journey, when he can see the horizon more clearly than the road behind him, something changes. He begins to look back with different eyes. The certainties that once seemed as solid as mountains begin to reveal themselves as shadows. The truths that were never questioned start to crack under the weight of accumulated years and accumulated doubts. My daughters don't speak to me. It has been years now. I know where they live. I know they have families of their own. I have grandchildren whose faces I've seen only in photographs that somehow find their way to me through distant relatives who haven't quite severed all ties. But their voices, their laughter, the warmth of their embrace, these are memories that grow fainter with each passing year. And in the nights of silence, when the house is empty and the darkness presses in from all sides, that distance hurts more than any punishment the governing body could ever devise. It cuts deeper than any disfellowshipping, any shunning, any spiritual discipline. Because this separation wasn't imposed by elders in a judicial committee. This separation grew from seeds I planted myself, watered with my own rigid adherence to rules I never questioned, fertilized with fear I mistook for faith. They taught me that the world outside was evil. From my earliest memories, that message was woven into every teaching, every meeting, every conversation. The world was Satan's domain, filled with temptation and moral decay. We were the chosen ones, the elect, those who had the truth while billions wandered in darkness. To protect ourselves, we needed to stay separate, to remain vigilant, to guard against any influence that might contaminate our pure worship. But with time, with painful experience, with a clarity that sometimes only comes when it's almost too late, I have come to understand something they never taught me. Darkness can exist within walls we consider holy. Cruelty can wear a suit and tie and carry a Bible. Lies can be printed on glossy paper and distributed as divine truth. And sometimes, the greatest evil is the evil we refuse to see because seeing it would require us to question everything we've built our lives upon. I think of my daughters now, as I sit in this house that feels too large and too empty. I think of the questions they asked, the doubts they voiced, the concerns they raised. I remember how I responded, not with love or patience or genuine consideration, but with anger and fear disguised as righteous indignation. I remember the words I said, words I cannot take back, words that built a wall between us brick by brick until neither of us could see the other anymore. They were right. God help me, they were right. And I was the one who was blind. The clock on the wall ticks steadily forward, marking time I cannot reclaim. Each second is a reminder of years I spent defending something that didn't deserve my defense. Each minute is an echo of conversations I refuse to have, warnings I refuse to hear, truths I refuse to acknowledge. 70 years. 7 decades of my one precious life, given to an organization that promised me eternal salvation and delivered instead the loss of what mattered most. How does a man reconcile that? How does he look at himself in the mirror and accept that he chose an institution over his own children? That he valued compliance over compassion, conformity over conscience, organizational loyalty over his own flesh and blood? These are the questions that keep me awake. These are the thoughts that chase me through the darkness of early morning. And these are the truths I can no longer avoid, no matter how much easier it would be to close my eyes and return to the comfortable numbness of unquestioning belief. This is my story. It is not unique, I have discovered. There are others like me, men and women who gave their lives to something that took more than it ever gave, who wake up in their later years and realize that the price of certainty was the loss of what made life worth living. But it is my story, and perhaps by telling it, by speaking these painful truths aloud, I can find some measure of peace. Or perhaps I can spare someone else the grief of learning these lessons too late. I am 70 years old, and I am finally learning to see. I was born into the organization. Not metaphorically, not through conversion in my adult years, but literally born into it. My mother was in her third trimester when she and my father attended their first meeting. By the time I drew my first breath, they were already studying, already convinced they had found the truth, already planning to raise me in the way. My parents were pioneers, the kind that others in the congregation looked up to. They didn't just meet the hourly requirements, they exceeded them consistently. Month after month, their field service reports were exemplary. My father would be out in service even on days when the weather was terrible, when rain soaked through his suit jacket and turned the pages of his magazines into pulp. My mother would schedule her entire life around the ministry, arranging her part-time work shifts to maximize her preaching hours, planning meals days in advance so she could spend more time knocking on doors. My grandparents, on my father's side, were among the first believers in our country. They had accepted the message in the 1920s, when the movement was still young and controversial, when being associated with the Bible students meant facing ridicule and sometimes persecution. My grandfather used to tell stories about police harassment, about neighbors who would cross the street to avoid them, about relatives who cut them off completely. But he wore those experiences like badges of honor. He believed he was suffering for righteousness' sake, and that suffering proved his devotion was genuine. This was the legacy I inherited. This was the foundation upon which my entire worldview was constructed. From the time I could understand language, I was taught that we were different, special, chosen. We had knowledge that others lacked. We saw clearly while the world stumbled in darkness. And with that knowledge came responsibility. The responsibility to share the message, to warn others, to remain separate from the world's corruption. Life was simple in those days, or at least it seemed simple through a child's eyes. There was a rhythm to our existence, a predictable pattern that gave structure to every week, every month, every year. Tuesday nights were for book study, held in different homes where we would gather around someone's living room and analyze publications paragraph by paragraph, answering questions printed at the bottom of each page, always arriving at the predetermined conclusions. Thursday nights were for the theocratic ministry school and service meeting, where we would practice our presentation techniques, give talks, and receive counsel on how to be more effective in our witnessing work. Sunday mornings and afternoons were for the Watchtower study and public talk, the main events of our week where we would dress in our best clothes and sit through 2 hours of instruction. And then there was field service. Saturdays were dedicated to door-to-door ministry, week after week, year after year. We would meet at the Kingdom Hall, receive our territory assignments, pair up, and spend hours walking through neighborhoods, climbing apartment stairs, pressing doorbells, delivering the same basic message with slight variations. Some in the congregation dreaded it, saw it as a burden to be endured. But I learned to love it, or at least I convinced myself I did. It made me feel purposeful, important. I was doing God's work. I was saving lives. What could be more meaningful than that? The assemblies were the highlights of our year. District conventions that lasted 3 or 4 days, where thousands would gather in stadiums or convention centers. We would bring lunches in coolers, spend entire days sitting on hard seats listening to talks, applauding at the appropriate moments, taking notes that we would rarely look at again. But there was a sense of belonging at those events, a feeling of being part of something vast and significant. Looking around at the sea of faces, all believing the same things, all sharing the same hope, created a powerful sense of unity. When I married, I chose a sister from within the congregation, as was expected. We met at an assembly. She was 3 years younger than me, from a family as devoted as mine. Our courtship was chaperoned. Our conversations focused on spiritual matters. We married young because that's what you did if you wanted to avoid temptation. And within 2 years, our first daughter was born. 2 years after that, our second. From the moment they entered the world, I knew exactly how I would raise them. They would grow up in the truth, just as I had. They would be protected from worldly influences, shielded from the corruption that destroyed so many young people. Our home would be a haven of righteousness, a place where Jehovah's standards were upheld without compromise. In our house, there were no birthday celebrations. When my daughter's birthdays came around, we treated them as ordinary days. If they asked why their classmates at school had parties while they didn't, I explained that birthdays were pagan celebrations, that the only birthday celebrations mentioned in the Bible ended badly. I taught them to be different, to stand apart, even if it meant being ostracized by their peers. There was no Christmas, no decorated tree in December, no presents wrapped in bright paper. No Easter egg hunts, no Halloween costumes, no Valentine's Day cards. Every holiday that other children celebrated, my daughters learned to view as false worship, as celebrations rooted in pagan tradition or, worse, in outright demon worship. When their teachers asked them to participate in holiday crafts or songs, they were instructed to politely decline and sit quietly while others celebrated. We didn't own a television for many years, and when we finally purchased one, its use was heavily restricted. Certain channels were forbidden entirely. Movies had to be carefully vetted. Any content that depicted violence, sexual immorality, spiritism, or disrespect for authority was prohibited. I monitored what they watched the way a prison guard monitors inmates, ready to switch off anything that might contaminate their minds. Instead of worldly entertainment, our home was filled with study material. There were books, magazines, and recorded talks. We had a collection of vinyl records containing district convention talks, and I would play them during dinner, believing that even our mealtimes should be opportunities for spiritual feeding. We would sit around the table, eating while listening to talks about the nearness of Armageddon, the importance of loyalty to the organization, the dangers of independent thinking. Every evening, we held family worship. We would sit together, open our Bibles, read assigned portions of Scripture, and discuss them using organization publications as our guide. I would ask questions, not genuine questions that invited real inquiry, but leading questions designed to elicit specific, predetermined answers. If my daughters gave responses that deviated from what the literature said, I would gently but firmly correct them, steering them back to the approved interpretation. I believed that this was love. I truly did. I thought that by controlling their environment so strictly, by limiting their exposure to outside influences, by drilling the organization's teachings into them night after night, I was protecting them. I was saving them from the world's corruption. I was ensuring they would survive Armageddon and live forever in the paradise earth. But with time, with painful hindsight, I have come to understand what I was actually doing. I wasn't expressing love. I was exercising control. I wasn't protecting them. I was isolating them. I wasn't teaching them to think critically about faith and morality. I was programming them to accept without question, to obey without hesitation, to suppress any doubts or concerns that might arise. I was creating an environment where devotion to an organization was more important than the development of their own conscience, their own relationship with God, their own ability to discern truth from error. I was building a cage and calling it a sanctuary. And I was doing it all with the absolute conviction that I was right, that I was following God's will, that any suffering my daughters might experience as a result of this upbringing would be worth it when they stood in paradise while the rest of the world had been destroyed. The home I built was meant to be a place of faith. But it became a place where questions were dangerous, where doubt was evidence of spiritual weakness, where love was conditional on compliance. And the tragedy is that I didn't see it. I couldn't see it. I had been so thoroughly indoctrinated myself that I couldn't distinguish between faith and fear, between devotion and blind obedience, between protecting my children and controlling them. That realization came much later. In those early years, I was certain, absolutely certain. And that certainty, I now understand, was the most dangerous thing of all. My daughters were curious children. Perhaps all children are curious, but mine seemed particularly so, especially my younger daughter. Even as a small child, she would ask, why, about everything. Why did we believe what we believed? Why did we do things this way and not another way? Why did the Bible say one thing in one place and something that seemed different in another place? At first, I found it endearing. I saw her curiosity as a sign of intelligence, evidence that she was engaging with spiritual matters. I would answer her questions patiently, always directing her to organization publications, showing her what the governing body had written on whatever subject she was asking about. I believed that if I could just explain things clearly enough, if I could just point her to the right articles and books, all her questions would be answered and her faith would be strengthened. But as she grew older, Her questions became more complex, more challenging, more difficult to answer with simple references to publications. She loved to read, everything she could get her hands on. We had a modest collection of Bible reference books, commentaries we kept from before we became witnesses, a few encyclopedias. She would pore over these materials, comparing what they said with what our publications said, noting differences and asking about them. She would read the same Bible passage in different translations and ask why the New World Translation rendered it differently. When I explained that our translation was more accurate, that the translators had been guided by Holy Spirit, she would ask how we could know that. She wasn't being rebellious. Not at first. She was genuinely trying to understand, trying to reconcile what seemed to her like contradictions or inconsistencies. I remember one particular evening. She must have been 14 or 15. We were having family worship, and we had been reading about the organization's history, about how Jehovah had been using this channel since the late 1800s to dispense truth. She looked up from the book and asked me a question that made my heart skip a beat. "Dad," she said, her voice quiet but clear, "why does Jehovah use only one organization if the Bible says that Jesus came for people, not for structures? Didn't Jesus criticize the religious leaders of his day for putting their traditions above God's commands?" I felt my face flush. The question itself was dangerous territory. It questioned the fundamental premise of everything we believed, that salvation came through association with God's organization, that leaving the organization meant leaving God himself. I responded the only way I knew how. I became angry. Not violently angry, not physically threatening, but cold and stern. I told her she needed to be careful with such thinking. I said that kind of questioning revealed a spirit of independence, the same spirit that led to Satan's rebellion. I explained that pride was at the root of all apostasy, and that her question suggested she thought she knew better than the faithful and discreet slave, the governing body who had been appointed by Jesus himself to feed his sheep. She didn't argue. She just became quiet, withdrew into herself. But I could see that my response hadn't satisfied her. It had silenced her, but it hadn't answered her genuine concern. I told myself that was enough, that obedience was more important than understanding, that in time she would mature and accept these things without questioning. But the questions didn't stop. They just became less frequent in my presence. Both my daughters, but especially the younger one, started noticing things I had never allowed myself to see. They would hear rumors, whispers at conventions or after meetings, stories about judicial committees that seemed harsh or unjust. They would hear about families torn apart by disfellowshipping, about young people who committed suicide after being shunned by everyone they'd ever known. They started noticing the inconsistencies in our teachings. We taught that we should have no part in politics, yet we required members to write letters to governments about policies that affected the organization. We taught that we should love our neighbors, yet we celebrated when natural disasters occurred, seeing them as signs of the end. We taught that God was love, yet we believed he would slaughter billions of men, women, and children at Armageddon simply because they hadn't accepted our message. And then they started learning about things that I had never heard about, things the organization had carefully kept hidden from rank-and-file members. They heard about the organization's membership in the United Nations as an NGO, something we had always taught was equivalent to riding the back of the wild beast in Revelation. They learned about property investments, about cases where kingdom halls had been sold and the proceeds sent to headquarters while congregations were told to continue donating for new kingdom halls. Most disturbing, they began hearing about cases of child abuse within congregations. Not just isolated incidents, but patterns of behavior that suggested systemic problems in how the organization handled such allegations. They heard about the two-witness rule that protected pedophiles, about elders who were instructed to call the legal department before calling the police, about victims who were disfellowshipped for speaking out while their abusers remained in good standing. They tried to show me these things. They would print articles from newspapers, court documents, testimonies from people who had experienced these failures firsthand. They would come to me with tears in their eyes, laying papers on the kitchen table, asking me to please just look at them with an open mind. And how did I respond? With rage. With absolute refusal to even consider what they were showing me. I would sweep the papers onto the floor without reading them, calling them lies from the world, apostate propaganda, persecution from Satan's system. I would raise my voice, demanding they throw away such material immediately, warning them that merely possessing it put them in spiritual danger. I don't want to see lies from the world. I would shout, my hands trembling with a mixture of anger and fear that I couldn't quite identify. This is exactly how the devil works. He mixes truth with lies, making poison look like food. But my daughters wouldn't give up easily. They loved me, I realize now. They weren't trying to destroy my faith out of malice or rebellion. They were genuinely concerned. They saw patterns that terrified them, and they wanted to protect me, to save me from devoting my entire life to something that had harmed so many others. "Dad," my younger daughter said during one particularly painful confrontation, her face wet with tears, "if these were lies, why would the organization be so afraid of them? Why do they tell us not to even look at anything critical? If we have the truth, shouldn't the truth be able to withstand examination? Shouldn't we be confident enough to investigate accusations instead of just dismissing them? Because it's a waste of time." I shouted back. Because giving attention to lies just spreads them further. Because we're supposed to focus on the truth, not on the garbage Satan's world produces to stumble us. "But Dad," she pressed, her voice breaking, "what if some of it isn't garbage? What if some of it is true? What if people are being hurt and the organization is covering it up? Don't we have a responsibility to care about that? Doesn't Jehovah hate the concealing of wickedness?" I ordered her to stop. I threatened her with discipline, with restrictions, with removal of privileges. And when threats didn't work, I resorted to emotional manipulation. I told her how disappointed I was, how she was breaking my heart, how her attitude was probably breaking Jehovah's heart too. I said that if she continued down this path, she would lose everything: her family, her friends, her hope of everlasting life. I painted her questioning as a slippery slope that would lead inevitably to destruction. Looking back now, I can see how terrified I was. Not terrified that my daughters were wrong, but terrified that they might be right. Because if they were right, if even a fraction of what they were trying to show me was true, then everything I had built my life upon was a lie. My entire identity, every sacrifice I had made, every hour I had spent in service, every relationship I had severed with worldly people, every opportunity one had rejected to stay faithful to the organization, all of it would have been for nothing. Worse than nothing. It would have been in service of something corrupt. So I couldn't look. I couldn't allow myself to see. The cost of seeing was too high. And instead of protecting my daughters, instead of loving them enough to investigate their concerns with an open mind, I attacked them. I made them the enemy. I transformed their love and concern into rebellion and apostasy. And with every confrontation, with every refusal to listen, with every harsh word, the gap between us grew wider. The foundation of our relationship, which should have been built on love and trust, cracked and crumbled. And I told myself I was doing the right thing, that I was putting God first, that I was being faithful even when it was difficult. But I wasn't putting God first. I was putting an organization first. And I was sacrificing my daughters on the altar of that organization's authority, all while convincing myself that I was being righteous. The questions my daughters asked weren't the problem. The problem was that I was too afraid to hear them. 4 years after my daughters' initial questions, I maintained my position. I doubled down on my faith, or what I told myself was faith. I increased my service hours, volunteered for additional responsibilities at the Kingdom Hall, made sure I never missed a meeting. I believed that by being exemplary in my devotion, I would prove to my daughters, and perhaps to myself, that the truth was worth any sacrifice. On the surface, everything appeared normal. I attended meetings twice a week without fail. I commented regularly, always offering answers that closely mirrored the paragraphs we were studying. I gave talks from the platform, standing before the congregation with apparent confidence, explaining Bible prophecies and organizational policies with the certainty of someone who had never doubted. I pioneered, going out in field service even when the weather was terrible, even when I was tired, even when doors slammed in my face and people told me they weren't interested. In the congregation, I was respected. Other elders sought my counsel. Younger brothers looked up to me. Families invited me to their homes for dinner, considering it an honor to have an elder at their table. At conventions, people who hadn't seen me in years would approach me warmly, commenting on how faithful I had remained, how they had heard I was still strong in the truth despite my daughter's choices. But something inside me had changed. It was subtle at first, so subtle I could pretend it wasn't happening. But with time, those small changes accumulated into something I could no longer ignore. I started noticing things at meetings and assemblies that I had overlooked before, or perhaps I had seen them all along but had never allowed myself to acknowledge them. The way certain talks emphasized obedience to the organization more than love for God or neighbor. The way dissent was characterized not as honest disagreement but as spiritual sickness, pride, or demonic influence. The way fear was used as a motivational tool, fear of Armageddon, fear of disfellowshipping, fear of disappointing the elders or the governing body, fear of losing family and friends. I began to see how information was controlled. We were encouraged to avoid higher education, not just because it might expose us to bad associations, but because educated people might develop critical thinking skills that would make them question organizational teachings. We were told to avoid certain websites, certain books, certain documentaries, not to watch them and then refute them with solid arguments, but to avoid them entirely because they might stumble us. As if truth were so fragile it couldn't withstand examination. I noticed how the organization's history was sanitized in our publications. We were taught about our faithful brothers and sisters of the past, but certain embarrassing episodes were omitted or glossed over. Failed prophecies about 1914, 1925, 1975, these were presented as minor adjustments in understanding rather than false predictions that had led thousands to make life-altering decisions based on incorrect information. Leaders who had been venerated when they were alive were subtly minimized after they died, their teachings quietly revised without acknowledgement that they had once been presented as divine truth. I saw the financial arrangements more clearly. We were constantly being encouraged to donate, to remember the organization in our wills, to give until it hurt. Yet there was no transparency about how money was spent, no financial statements available for members to review, no accountability to those who provided the funds. When kingdom halls were built using donated labor and materials, then sold for profit that went to headquarters rather than the local congregation, questions were discouraged. Trust in Jehovah's organization was the standard response to any inquiry about finances. But perhaps most troubling were the things I witnessed in elder meetings and judicial committees. These were supposed to be occasions when spiritually mature men, guided by Holy Spirit and the organization's procedures, would help those struggling with sin or doubt. Instead, I increasingly saw them as exercises in control and conformity. I remember one particular case that disturbed me deeply. A young brother in his early 20s came before a judicial committee. He had confessed to his parents that he no longer believed certain teachings, not that he wanted to live immorally, not that he rejected God or the Bible, but that he couldn't reconcile certain doctrines with what he read in Scripture. His parents, alarmed, had reported him to the elders. The committee meeting was painful to witness. 3 of us sat across from this young man who was visibly distraught. He tried to explain his concerns respectfully, quoting scriptures, asking questions. But the committee chairman cut him off repeatedly. "These questions show a lack of humility," he said sternly. "The faithful and discreet slave has already explained these matters. Your job isn't to question but to accept and obey." The young man tried again. "But I'm not trying to cause problems. I'm genuinely struggling with these teachings. Can't we discuss them? Can't you help me understand?" "There's nothing to discuss," another elder interjected. "Either you accept what we've been taught, or you're choosing to be an apostate. It's that simple." In the end, despite the young man's obvious sincerity and his desire to remain faithful to God if not to every organizational teaching, he was disfellowshipped. His crime wasn't immorality or lawlessness. His crime was thinking independently, asking questions, unable to suppress his doubts even when ordered to do so. I sat in that room and said nothing. I didn't defend him. I didn't suggest a more compassionate approach. I voted with the other 2 elders to disfellowship him. And as we announced his removal to the congregation the following week, I watched his parents' faces crumble, knowing that they would now be expected to shun their own son, to treat him as if he were dead. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about my own daughters, wondering if they would someday face a similar committee, if I would be expected to shun them completely if they were formally disfellowshipped. The thought terrified me, but I pushed it away, telling myself that such situations were necessary discipline, that the organization's survival depended on protecting itself from poisonous influences. Another incident shook me even more. A brother I had known for years, a man I admired, someone who had helped me through difficult times, was accused by a young woman in the congregation of inappropriate conduct. She claimed he had made advances toward her when she came to him for spiritual counsel, that he had touched her inappropriately, that when she resisted, he had become angry and threatened to damage her reputation if she spoke about it. At first, I didn't want to believe her. This brother was well-liked, had a good family, had served faithfully for decades. Surely there was some misunderstanding, some mistake. But as the elders began investigating, more information emerged. This wasn't the first accusation. There had been whispers before, incidents in other congregations where he had served. But each time, the allegations had been dismissed due to the two-witness rule. Since there weren't two eyewitnesses to the inappropriate conduct, no action could be taken. The young woman was devastated. She had gathered the courage to come forward, expecting that she would be believed, that the elders would protect her. Instead, she was questioned harshly. Was she sure she hadn't misinterpreted his intentions? Had she dressed modestly? Had she perhaps been too friendly, giving him the wrong impression? The questions implied that she might bear some responsibility for his behavior. Meanwhile, the accused brother maintained his innocence. He claimed the young woman was lying, that she was mentally unstable, that she was making these accusations because he had counseled her about her own spiritual weaknesses and she was seeking revenge. Without two witnesses, the committee was deadlocked. Then we received a call from the legal department at headquarters. They instructed us on how to handle the situation, emphasizing that we should not report the matter to police unless legally required in our jurisdiction. They were concerned about protecting the organization from liability, from the possibility of lawsuits, from negative publicity. The young woman's well-being seemed secondary to these organizational concerns. In the end, the brother received a private reproof, a mild discipline that meant nothing changed in his standing within the congregation. The young woman, however, was counseled about making wild accusations, and about the importance of forgiveness. She stopped attending meetings shortly after. I heard later that she had attempted suicide. When I learned this, I felt physically sick. But what could I do? I was bound by the organization's procedures. If I spoke out, if I questioned these processes, I would be the one disciplined. I would be the one accused of not trusting in Jehovah's arrangement, of causing division, of having an independent spirit. So I remained silent. I went along with decisions I knew in my heart were wrong. I prioritized organizational unity over justice for victims. These experiences accumulated like weights on my shoulders. Each one added to a growing sense of unease, a feeling that something fundamental was wrong with the system I had devoted my life to defending. But I was trapped, not by physical walls or chains, but by fear. Fear of losing everything. Fear of admitting I might have been wrong for so many years. Fear of facing the possibility that my daughter's questions had been legitimate, that their concerns had been valid, that I had rejected them not because they were wrong but because I was too frightened to consider that they might be right. At meetings, I would sit and listen to talks about how we had the truth, how we were part of Jehovah's organization, how we needed to remain loyal no matter what. And increasingly, those words sounded hollow to me. They were like echoes in an empty room, loud but without substance. I started experiencing what I can only describe as a kind of spiritual vertigo. The certainties that had anchored me for so long were shifting beneath my feet. I didn't know what to believe anymore. But I also didn't know how to stop believing, how to step away from the only identity I had ever known. So I continued the performance. I smiled at meetings. I gave talks. I went out in service. I maintained the appearance of unwavering faith. But inside, the cracks were spreading, and I knew that eventually, something would have to give. The wall I had built to protect myself from doubt was developing fault lines. And though I tried to ignore them, tried to patch them with renewed zeal and increased activity, I could feel the structure beginning to destabilize. It was only a matter of time before it collapsed completely. The breaking point came gradually, then all at once. My daughters had continued attending meetings sporadically through their late teenage years, more out of obligation and fear than conviction. They sat in the back rows, barely participated, left immediately when meetings ended. I could see them pulling away, and it terrified me. But instead of reaching out with love and understanding, I responded with increased pressure and control. I made rules. If they lived in my house, they would attend every meeting. They would participate in family worship. They would go out in field service at least once a month. They would dress modestly. They would avoid any association with worldly people outside of school. I thought that by enforcing these standards, I could keep them in the truth, could prevent them from making the biggest mistake of their lives. But you cannot force someone to believe. You cannot legislate faith. And my iron-fisted approach only pushed them further away. My older daughter was the first to leave. She had just turned 19, had finished school, and had been working part-time while pioneering, or at least, that's what she told me she was doing. One Sunday morning, as we were getting ready for the meeting, she came downstairs with her bags packed. "I'm moving out," she announced quietly. "I found an apartment with some friends. I can't do this anymore, Dad. I can't keep pretending to believe things I don't believe. I can't keep living a lie." The words hit me like a physical blow. "You're making the biggest mistake of your life," I said, my voice shaking. "If you walk out that door, if you leave Jehovah's organization, you're choosing death over life. Is that what you want?" She looked at me with tears in her eyes. "I'm not leaving God, Dad. I'm leaving an organization that I don't believe represents God. There's a difference." "There is no difference," I shouted. "The organization is God's channel. Leaving the organization is leaving God. How can you not see that?" "Because I've read the Bible," she said softly. "Really read it, without the organization's interpretation filtering every verse. And I don't see this organizational structure anywhere in Jesus' teachings. I see him criticizing religious leaders who place their authority above people's relationship with God. I see him reaching out to the marginalized, the doubters, the sinners. I see love and compassion, not rules and punishment and shunning." I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to grab her, to force her to stay, to somehow prevent her from throwing away her salvation. But another part of me, a part one was barely aware of, recognized truth in what she was saying. That part frightened me more than anything. "If you leave," I said, switching tactics, trying to invoke guilt, "you'll break your mother's heart. You'll disgrace this family. Everyone in the congregation will know. Is that what you want? To humiliate us?" "Dad," she said, her voice breaking, "I love you and Mom, but I have to live my own life. I have to be true to my own conscience. I'm not doing this to hurt you. I'm doing this because I can't keep sacrificing my mental health, my integrity, my authentic self to maintain an appearance that makes everyone else comfortable." She walked out, and I let her go. Not out of respect for her autonomy, but because I didn't know how to stop her. As the door closed behind her, I stood in the living room, feeling like my world was ending. The congregation's response was swift. Word spread quickly that my daughter had left home, that she had stopped attending meetings. The elders came to speak with me, offering condolences as if she had died. They reminded me that I had to remain strong, that I couldn't let her choices affect my service to Jehovah. They suggested that perhaps if I and my wife shunned her completely, if we made it clear there would be no relationship until she returned to the organization, she might come to her senses. "She hasn't been disfellowshipped," I protested weakly. "She's just inactive." "But she's clearly living a worldly life now," one elder responded. "The principle is the same. You need to protect your spiritual health and the spiritual health of your other daughter. Limited contact, and only about necessary family matters. No socialization, no normalizing her choice to leave Jehovah." So that's what I did. When my older daughter reached out, I kept our conversations brief and cold. When she invited us to see her new apartment, I declined. When she called to share news about her life, I found excuses to end the conversation quickly. I was following the organization's counsel, treating her rejection of the organization as a rejection of the family itself. My younger daughter watched all of this unfold. She saw how I treated her sister, saw the pain it caused, saw the cruelty of a system that demanded parents abandon their children for thought crime. And it hardened something in her. 2 years later, she made her own decision to leave. She was more confrontational about it than her sister had been. She sat me down and laid out all her reasons, all the research she had done, all the evidence she had accumulated of organizational wrongdoing. She showed me documented cases of child abuse cover-ups, financial misconduct, doctrinal flip-flops, false prophecies. She begged me to look at it all with an open mind. "Dad, please," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I'm not asking you to leave. I'm just asking you to look. To really look. To consider the possibility that you've been lied to. That we've all been lied to. Can you do that? Can you at least investigate these claims before dismissing them?" I couldn't. Or wouldn't. The distinction didn't matter. I took the papers she had printed and threw them in the trash without reading them. I told her she had been poisoned by apostate lies, that she was allowing Satan to deceive her, that if she continued down this path, she would lose me, her mother, her sister, her faith, and ultimately her life. "You've already lost me," she said quietly. "You lost me the moment you chose an organization over your own children." She left that night. And in accordance with the organization's guidance, and in a cruel imitation of righteousness, I called her an apostate. I told other members of the congregation that my daughters had become apostates, that they had rejected the truth, that faithful members should avoid them. I said these things publicly, making sure everyone knew where I stood, making sure no one would question my loyalty to the organization. The pain of their departure was immense, but I buried it deep. I told myself I was feeling natural affection, that I had to overcome in order to remain faithful. I compared myself to Abraham, willing to sacrifice what he loved most in obedience to God. I framed my suffering as a test of faith, proof of my devotion. But in the quiet moments when I was alone, I felt something else, something I couldn't name, something that felt like grief and guilt and growing doubt all tangled together. I would find myself picking up the phone to call them, then putting it down before dialing. I would see something that reminded me of them and have to fight back tears. I would hear news about their lives through distant relatives and feel an ache in my chest that no amount of prayer could ease. At meetings, brothers and sisters would commend me for my faithfulness in the face of such trials. They would tell me I was setting a fine example, that my willingness to put Jehovah first even above my own children proved the genuineness of my faith. Their praise made me feel sick, but I accepted it, nodding humbly, thanking them for their encouragement. Years passed. My daughters continued reaching out occasionally, sending letters that I would read once and then destroy, terrified that keeping them would be evidence of spiritual weakness. They sent photos of their lives. My older daughter getting married to a kind man, my younger daughter graduating from university. They included messages saying they still loved us, that they wanted us in their lives, that their door was always open. I never responded. Not with kindness, anyway. When I did reply, my messages were cold and brief, always ending with some version of, "You know what you need to do if you want a relationship with us." I convinced myself this was righteous, that I was being loyal to God, that their pain and my pain were necessary sacrifices on the altar of truth. But what I was actually doing, what I couldn't see at the time, what I'm only now beginning to understand, was killing something precious. I was murdering the relationship with my children, not because they had done anything truly wrong, not because they had hurt me, but because they had dared to think for themselves, to question, to investigate, to follow their conscience instead of blindly obeying. I was choosing an institution over the people I had brought into this world. I was valuing conformity over love. And I was doing it all while believing I was being righteous, while believing I was following God's will, while believing that someday, when they came crawling back to the organization, they would thank me for being so firm, so uncompromising. In the quiet of my house, in the absence of their laughter and their voices, in the empty bedrooms that still held traces of their childhood, I would sometimes break down. I would cry alone, asking Jehovah why it had to be this way, why holding on to the truth required such painful sacrifices. But I never questioned whether the sacrifices were necessary. I never questioned whether the organization that demanded them might be wrong. I never allowed myself to consider that the pain I was experiencing wasn't a test of faith, but a consequence of choosing loyalty to an organization over love for my children. In the congregation, I was praised. In my own home, I was alone. And in my heart, though I wouldn't admit it for years, I was dying. Everything changed on a Thursday evening in early spring. I remember the date exactly, March 14th, though I wish I could forget it. I had been an elder for over 30 years at that point. I had served on countless judicial committees, counseled numerous struggling brothers and sisters, given hundreds of talks, attended thousands of meetings. I thought I had seen everything the congregation could throw at me. I was wrong. The call came at 8:47 p.m. Another elder, Brother Martinez, who had been my friend for 2 decades. His voice was shaking. "We have a situation," he said. "Can you come to the Kingdom Hall? We need to meet immediately." 20 minutes later, I sat in the back room with 4 other elders. Brother Martinez explained the situation, his hands trembling as he spoke. A teenage girl from our congregation, a quiet, studious girl I had watched grow up, had made an accusation against Brother Thompson, one of our most respected elders, a man in his late 50s who had been serving faithfully since before I was born. She claimed he had been sexually abusing her for over a year. It had started with inappropriate comments, progressed to touching, and eventually to more serious acts. She had finally gathered the courage to tell her parents, who brought her to us. My first instinct was disbelief. Brother Thompson? The man who gave the most moving talks at assemblies? Who had helped so many people through spiritual difficulties? Who seemed to exemplify everything an elder should be? It couldn't be true. There had to be some mistake, some misunderstanding. But as the girl sat before us, trembling and tearful, describing events in detail that no child should have to articulate, doubt began to creep in. She knew things, specific things about Brother Thompson's home, his schedule, his habits, details that didn't align with the public service interactions they supposedly had. Her account was consistent, detailed, and devastating. We followed the organization's procedures. We questioned her extensively, more extensively than I'm comfortable remembering now. We asked her to repeat her story multiple times, looking for inconsistencies. We asked uncomfortable questions about her own behavior, her clothing, whether she had done anything to encourage his attention. We asked these things because the manual told us to, because we needed to establish credibility, because without 2 witnesses, we couldn't take action. And of course, there were no witnesses. Predators don't abuse children in front of others. That's the point. We called the legal department at headquarters, as instructed. A lawyer there spent 40 minutes on the phone with us, asking questions, taking notes. His primary concern seemed to be protecting the organization from legal liability. He asked repeatedly whether we were in a state that mandated clergy reporting of abuse. We weren't. He advised us not to report to authorities unless legally required. He said we should handle it internally. But what about the girl? I asked, my voice sounding strange to my own ears. What about her protection? What about justice for her? Handle it according to the biblical procedure, the lawyer said smoothly. If there aren't 2 witnesses and he denies it, there's nothing you can do ecclesiastically. But make sure you document everything carefully. If this goes to civil court, we need records. We brought Brother Thompson in. He was calm, dignified, seemingly confused by the accusation. He denied everything completely. He suggested the girl might be mentally unstable, that she might have developed an inappropriate crush on him, and when he properly maintained boundaries, she became vindictive. He spoke eloquently about his decades of faithful service, his clean record, his family's reputation. Without 2 witnesses, we were at an impasse. The organization's rules were clear. You couldn't establish wrongdoing based on one person's testimony, no matter how credible. It was his word against hers. And in that equation, the decades of service from a respected elder outweighed the testimony of a teenage girl. We decided on a compromise. Brother Thompson would receive private counsel about maintaining appropriate boundaries, though officially this wasn't an admission of wrongdoing, just prudent advice. He would be assigned to work only with brothers in field service, not sisters, to avoid even the appearance of evil. But he would retain his position as an elder. His reputation would remain intact. The girl and her family were devastated. They had expected justice, protection, vindication. Instead, they received advice to forgive, to move on, to trust in Jehovah. Her father was counseled not to take legal action, reminded that taking a brother to court would bring reproach on Jehovah's organization. The implicit threat was clear: If they pursued this outside the congregation, they might face discipline themselves. They left the congregation shortly after. I heard they moved to another city, wanted a fresh start away from the place where she had been victimized twice, once by her abuser, once by the system that was supposed to protect her. 4 weeks after, I tried to tell myself we had handled it properly, that we had followed procedure, that we couldn't take action without evidence. But something inside me had broken during that meeting. I kept seeing her face, the way her hope had died when she realized we weren't going to help her. I kept hearing her quiet question, "Don't you believe me?" And honestly, I did believe her. Every instinct I had told me she was telling the truth. But the rules said I couldn't act on instinct. The rules said I needed evidence that was impossible to obtain. The rules, I was beginning to realize, were designed to protect the organization's reputation, not to protect victims. I started researching. Not openly. I couldn't risk being caught with apostate material. But carefully, privately, using incognito browser windows on my computer late at night when my wife was asleep. I began looking into the cases my daughters had tried to show me years earlier, the allegations they had wanted me to investigate. What I found shattered me. Case after case after case of abuse within congregations, spanning decades, spanning continents. Thousands of abusers documented in internal organization records, but not reported to authorities. Victims silenced, threatened, disfellowshipped for speaking out while their abusers remained in good standing. Legal battles where the organization fought tooth and nail to avoid releasing documents, paying millions in settlements while admitting no wrongdoing. I found court testimonies from survivors who described exactly what had happened in our congregation, going to elders for help, being questioned harshly, being told to forgive, being warned not to bring reproach on Jehovah's name by reporting to police. I found documented cases where known pedophiles were transferred to other congregations without warning, where they went on to abuse more children because no one had been told about their history. I found documentation of the two-witness rule being applied even in cases where there was substantial circumstantial evidence, where multiple victims had made accusations at different times but none had witnessed each other's abuse. I found legal depositions where governing body members testified under oath, admitting to policies that prioritized organizational reputation over child safety. And I found something else, the documents my younger daughter had tried to show me years earlier. I found them online, available for anyone to read. Court transcripts, investigation reports, testimony from former elders who had left in disgust over how abuse cases were handled. Everything she had tried to show me, everything I had refused to look at, was documented, verifiable, true. I sat at my computer one night, reading until my eyes burned and my head pounded, clicking through page after page of evidence. And at some point, around 3 a.m., I began to cry. Not quiet tears, but deep, wrenching sobs that came from somewhere primal inside me. 4 decades, I had defended this organization. 4 decades, I had assured people it was God's channel, that it could be trusted completely, that its leaders were guided by Holy Spirit. 4 decades, I had told people to submit to its authority, to obey its rules, to accept its discipline without question. And all that time, behind the carefully maintained facade of righteousness, there was this. A system that protected abusers. Rules that silenced victims. Policies that prioritized image over justice. Leaders who knew about these problems and did nothing, or worse, actively worked to conceal them. I thought about the girl from our congregation. I thought about Brother Thompson, who was still serving as an elder, still working with young people, still seen as a pillar of the community. I thought about how we had treated her, how we had doubted her, how we had counseled her to be quiet and move on. And I felt physically sick. But more than that, I thought about my daughters. I thought about how they had tried to warn me, how they had begged me to look at evidence, how they had wept in frustration when I refused to listen. They hadn't been apostates. They hadn't been rebellious or prideful or spiritually weak. They had been right. And I had called them liars. I had shunned them. I had chosen an organization that covered up child abuse over my own children who had tried to protect me from devoting my life to that organization. The weight of that realization was crushing. I sat at that computer, bathed in the blue light of the monitor, surrounded by the evidence of institutional corruption and my own complicity in it, and I felt like my entire life had been a lie. Every sacrifice had been for nothing. Every decision I had made in service of the organization, had been a decision to serve something unworthy of service. I thought about all the people I had counseled to stay loyal, to obey even when it was difficult, to trust the governing body even when things didn't make sense. I thought about the judicial committees I had served on, the people I had judged, the families I had told to shun their loved ones. I thought about the young man who had been disfellowshipped for asking questions, the woman who had stopped attending after her abuse was dismissed, the countless others whose lives had been damaged by this system I had helped enforce. And I realized something that changed everything. I had been so focused on defending the organization, on proving my loyalty, on maintaining my position and reputation, that I had forgotten to ask the most fundamental question. Not, is this organization following its own rules? But, are these rules just? Are they loving? Are they what God would actually want? I had confused organizational loyalty with faithfulness to God. I had assumed that because the organization claimed to represent God, anything it did must be righteous. I had given humans, the governing body, the elders, the structure itself, an authority that belonged only to God. And in doing so, I had participated in a system that caused immense suffering while claiming to be the sole channel of divine truth. The sun was rising when I finally closed the laptop. I had been up all night, reading, weeping, thinking. My wife found me sitting in the dark, staring at nothing. "Are you all right?" she asked, concerned. I couldn't answer. Because I wasn't all right. I would never be all right again. Something fundamental had shifted inside me, something that couldn't be unshifted. I had seen behind the curtain, and I couldn't unsee what was there. The God I believed in was loving, just, compassionate. The God I believed in would never sanction a system that protected pedophiles and punished victims. The God I believed in would never demand that parents abandon their children for the crime of asking questions. The God I believed in cared more about people than about organizational reputation. And if that was true, if God was who I believed him to be, then this organization could not be his sole channel. Because its actions revealed something very different from divine love. That realization didn't come all at once. It built slowly over the following weeks and months. But that night, reading the evidence my daughters had tried to show me years earlier, was when the foundation cracked irreparably. Everything I built my life on began to crumble. And though it was terrifying, though it meant facing the possibility that I had been wrong about nearly everything, there was also something liberating about it. For the first time in my adult life, I was thinking for myself. The weeks following that night were the most difficult of my life. I continued attending meetings, continued serving as an elder, continued maintaining the appearance of faithful devotion. But inside, I was dying. Or perhaps I was being reborn. The metaphor seemed apt for both processes. I couldn't unhear what I had heard, couldn't unsee what I had seen. Every meeting felt like a performance, every talk like a lie, every prayer like a conversation with a God I no longer trusted the organization to represent accurately. I would sit in the Kingdom Hall, looking around at all the faces I had known for decades, and wonder how many of them harbored secret doubts. How many were going through the motions out of fear rather than faith? How many had seen things that troubled them but remained silent because the cost of speaking out was too high? I stopped participating in judicial committees. When asked to serve on them, I found excuses. I was too busy, I didn't feel qualified, I had conflicts that made me unable to judge fairly. The other elders noticed, but they chalked it up to stress, to the difficulties with my daughters, to perhaps a period of spiritual weakness that I would overcome with time and prayer. I began carefully, cautiously, reaching out to my daughters. First just a text message to my older daughter, something simple, "How are you?" 3 words, but they felt monumental. She responded immediately, as if she had been waiting years for any sign of opening. We began texting regularly, then talking on the phone. She was cautious at first, uncertain whether this was genuine or another attempt to manipulate her back into the organization. But gradually, she began to trust that something had changed. My younger daughter was harder to reach. She had been hurt more deeply, had tried harder to make me see, had been rejected more explicitly. When I finally called her, she answered but said little. I could hear the wariness in her voice, the barely controlled anger, the residual pain from years of being dismissed and shunned. "I've been doing some reading," I told her, my voice shaking. "The things you tried to show me. The documents about the organization. I've been looking at them. Silence on the other end. Then, quietly, and you were right. About all of it. I'm so sorry I didn't listen. I'm so sorry I chose the organization over you. I'm so sorry for everything. She began to cry. So did I. We stayed on the phone for over 2 hours, talking about everything. Her experiences growing up, the fear and control she had lived under, the relief when she finally left, the pain of being cut off from her family. I listened without defending myself, without making excuses, without trying to minimize her hurt. I just listened, finally, years too late. "Dad," she said eventually, her voice thick with emotion, "we didn't want to destroy your faith. We wanted to save you from it." Those words broke something open in me. They hadn't been trying to hurt me or rebel against me or prove they were smarter than me. They had loved me enough to risk my anger, my rejection, my condemnation, because they couldn't bear to watch me devote my entire life to something they knew was harmful. And I had repaid their love with coldness, judgment, and abandonment. Over the following months, I began rebuilding relationships with my daughters. It was slow, tentative work. Trust, once broken, takes time to restore. But they were remarkably gracious, more gracious than I deserved. They introduced me to their lives, my older daughter's husband, who welcomed me warmly despite knowing how I had treated his wife. My younger daughter's career and accomplishments, the education I had once told her was unnecessary and spiritually dangerous. I met my grandchildren for the first time. Grandchildren I hadn't known existed because I had been too proud and too fearful to maintain a relationship with their mother. They were beautiful, innocent, full of life and curiosity. And as I held them, I felt the full weight of what I had missed, what I had sacrificed for an organization that had never deserved such sacrifice. But reconciling with my daughters was only part of the journey. I still had to figure out what I believed, who I was apart from the identity I had worn for 7 decades. I had to reckon with the God I claimed to worship, to determine whether faith itself was the problem or whether it was the way faith had been weaponized by the organization. I began reading the Bible without organization publications as a filter. Just the Bible, in multiple translations, reading whole books at a time rather than cherry-picked verses. And what I found surprised me. The Jesus presented in the Gospels bore little resemblance to the Jesus preached from our platforms. The biblical Jesus spent time with doubters, sinners, outcasts. He criticized religious leaders who placed their authority above people's well-being. He spoke in parables that invited thought and interpretation rather than demanding blind obedience. He emphasized love, compassion, mercy, values that seemed absent from the system I had spent my life defending. I also began reading about religious manipulation, cult dynamics, thought control. I learned about high control groups and the techniques they use to maintain power over members. Information control, behavioral control, emotional manipulation, doctrinal authority. I saw how the organization I had been part of employed many of these same tactics. And I understood, finally, how I had been conditioned over decades to suppress my own critical thinking, to dismiss my own conscience, to prioritize organizational loyalty above everything else, including my own children. This understanding didn't come without cost. As I began to question more openly, as I started missing meetings or making comments that revealed my changing perspective, the elders took notice. I was called in for meetings, counseled about my spiritual health, encouraged to increase my field service and meeting attendance to combat my doubts. When I asked questions, genuine questions about organizational policies, about handling of abuse cases, about failed prophecies and doctrinal changes, the response was always the same. Trust in Jehovah's organization, wait on Jehovah, avoid independent thinking. No one would engage with my actual concerns. They would simply redirect to the importance of obedience and loyalty. Eventually, I realized I had a choice to make. I could continue pretending, living a lie to maintain my position and relationships within the congregation. Or I could be honest about what I had discovered, accept the consequences, and finally live with integrity. The decision wasn't easy. Leaving meant losing almost everyone I knew. It meant being labeled an apostate, being shunned by people I had considered friends for decades. It meant my wife would face pressure to leave me or at least to limit our relationship. It meant acknowledging that my entire adult life had been built on a foundation of sand. But staying meant continuing to be complicit in a system that harmed people. It meant continuing to enforce policies I now believed were cruel and unjust. It meant sacrificing my conscience and my relationship with my daughters on the altar of an organization that didn't deserve such sacrifice. In the end, I chose honesty. I stepped down as an elder, citing personal reasons. When pressed for more details, I was direct. I could no longer support certain organizational policies, particularly regarding how abuse allegations were handled and how families were expected to shun their loved ones. I said I needed time to reevaluate my beliefs and that I would not be attending meetings for the foreseeable future. The response was swift and predictable. I was labeled an apostate. Announcements were made to the congregation that I was no longer one of Jehovah's Witnesses. People I had known for 40 years crossed the street to avoid me. My phone stopped ringing. Invitations to gatherings ceased. I became, effectively, socially dead to everyone I had once called brothers and sisters. My wife struggled with the situation. She had been more accepting of the organization than I had become, less willing to examine troubling evidence. The congregation pressured her to leave me, to prove her loyalty to Jehovah by choosing the organization over her unfaithful husband. To her credit, she didn't leave, though our relationship became strained. We're still working through it, trying to find common ground, trying to figure out what our marriage looks like when we no longer share the central organizing principle that shaped our entire life together. But my daughters welcomed me with open arms. They celebrated not my leaving the organization, but my willingness to finally investigate truth wherever it led, to value love over loyalty to an institution, to admit I had been wrong. They didn't gloat or say, "I told you so," though they had every right to. They simply embraced me and said, "Welcome home, Dad." Today, I don't know exactly where I stand spiritually. I still believe in God, though my conception of God has changed dramatically. I still value faith, though I now understand that faith should never require the suppression of conscience or the rejection of evidence. I still find meaning in spiritual practice, though I'm exploring what that looks like outside organizational structure. What I do know is this: God is not confined to buildings or publications. Truth doesn't require protection from examination. Love should never be conditional on obedience to human authority. And family, real family, based on authentic connection rather than shared ideology, is more valuable than any organizational approval. I think about all the years I spent defending the organization, all the people I counseled to remain loyal even when it cost them dearly, all the families I told to shun their loved ones. I can't undo those things. I can't take back the pain I caused. But I can be honest now about what I've learned. I can speak truth now instead of perpetuating comfortable lies. And I can be present for my daughters and their families in a way I never was before. I can show them the love they always deserved, without conditions, without requirements, without demands that they believe or behave in certain ways to earn my approval. I can finally be the father I should have been all along. Is it enough? Can it make up for the years of pain, the relationships damaged, the trust broken? Probably not. But it's what I can do now, in the time I have left. And maybe that's enough. Maybe choosing to see the truth, even when it's painful, even when it costs everything, is its own form of redemption. I am 70 years old. And finally, I am learning what it means to be free. 70 years as a Jehovah's Witness. 7 decades of my life given to an organization that promised me eternal salvation and delivered instead the loss of what mattered most. 70 years of believing I was serving God while actually serving a human institution that demanded total loyalty and gave very little in return. My daughters were right. That's the hardest thing to admit, but it's also the most important. They were right when they questioned. They were right when they investigated. They were right when they refused to accept teachings that didn't align with conscience or evidence. They were right when they walked away, even knowing it would cost them their family, their community, their entire social structure. And I was wrong. Wrong to dismiss their concerns without investigation. Wrong to prioritize organizational loyalty over their well-being. Wrong to enforce rules that caused tremendous pain while claiming it was for their own good. Wrong to believe that an organization's claim to authority made that authority legitimate. For most of my life, I was taught that seeking truth outside the organization was betrayal. That questioning was evidence of spiritual weakness. That investigation was dangerous and should be avoided. I believed these teachings so completely that I couldn't see how they served to protect the organization from scrutiny rather than to protect me from error. But I've discovered something profound in these final years of my life. The truth doesn't fear investigation. Real truth can withstand examination, can survive questioning, can emerge stronger from honest inquiry. Only lies and deceptions require protection from scrutiny. Only false teachings need to forbid investigation. The organization taught me that they alone had truth, that everyone outside was deceived or wicked, that leaving would mean abandoning God. But now I understand that this is how high-control groups operate, by creating fear of the outside, by making members dependent on the group for their identity and social structure, by making the cost of leaving so high that most people stay even when they no longer believe. I've learned that there's a difference between faith and blind obedience. Faith can coexist with questions, with doubts, with honest examination of evidence. Blind obedience requires the suppression of conscience, the rejection of critical thinking, the elevation of human authority to divine status. I thought I had faith, but what I actually had was conditioned compliance. I've learned that true love doesn't require conformity. The organization taught me that love meant correcting people, disciplining them, shunning them if they didn't comply. But real love, the kind my daughters showed me even when I rejected them, meets people where they are, accepts them as they are, values relationship over agreement. I've learned that integrity sometimes requires standing alone. That doing the right thing often means losing everything you thought was important. That speaking truth can cost you your reputation, your community, your sense of identity. And that even knowing these costs, integrity demands we speak truth anyway. Most painfully, I've learned that silence in the face of injustice makes us complicit in that injustice. For years, I saw things that troubled me, heard stories that didn't sit right, witnessed policies that seemed cruel. But I remained silent because speaking up would have put my position at risk, would have marked me as disloyal, would have cost me the respect and fellowship I had worked so hard to earn. That silence was not neutral. It was a choice to allow harm to continue rather than risk my own comfort. Sometimes, the truest act of faith is to question. The greatest betrayal isn't doubt, it's refusing to examine whether what you're defending is worthy of defense. Calling something the truth doesn't make it true. Claiming divine authority doesn't grant divine authority. And remaining loyal to an organization that protects abusers, breaks up families, and controls information isn't faithfulness to God. It's faithfulness to human institution that doesn't deserve such loyalty. I don't know how much time I have left. At 70, I'm acutely aware that more of my life is behind me than ahead of me. But I know this. I would rather spend whatever time remains living with integrity and honest relationships than spend another day defending lies to maintain appearances. I would rather die free with the truth than live imprisoned in a comfortable lie. I would rather face whatever comes next having loved my daughters authentically than enter any promised paradise having rejected them for an organization. I would rather stand before God, if there is a judgment, and account for my mistakes while knowing I finally chose conscience over compliance than arrive having perfectly followed rules that demanded I sacrifice what matters most. And if my words reach someone who is where I was, afraid to look, afraid to question, afraid to consider the possibility that they might have been deceived, I want to tell them this. Your doubts are not evidence of spiritual weakness. Your questions are not signs of apostasy. Your conscience is not leading you astray when it recoils from cruelty disguised as righteousness. And your love for your family is not less important than your loyalty to an organization, regardless of what that organization claims. The truth doesn't destroy faith. It purifies it. It burns away the falsehoods, the manipulations, the fear-based compliance, and leaves behind something more genuine, a faith based on choice rather than coercion, on love rather than fear, on evidence and conscience rather than blind obedience to human authority. My daughters saved me. Not from God, not from faith, not from the possibility of spirituality. They saved me from wasting my entire life defending something unworthy of defense. They saved me from dying without ever knowing the joy of authentic relationship unmediated by organizational requirements. They saved me from the ultimate tragedy, reaching the end of life and realizing I had sacrificed what mattered most for what didn't matter at all. I'm 70 years old. I've lost decades I can't reclaim. I've caused pain I can't fully repair. I've made choices I deeply regret. But I've also found something I didn't have before: freedom. The freedom to think, to question, to investigate, to change my mind. The freedom to love without conditions, to value truth over comfort, to choose integrity over approval. And in these final years or months or however long I'm finally learning what I should have understood all along. That God, if God exists, is big enough to handle our questions. That truth is worth seeking, even when we don't like what we find. That love is more important than being right. And that sometimes the people we thought were leading us astray were actually trying to lead us home. My daughters were right. And I'm grateful, more grateful than I can express, that I finally learned to see it, even though it came so late. If you're reading this and you're afraid to look, afraid to question, afraid of what you might discover, I understand. I lived in that fear for 7 decades. But I promise you this, whatever you find on the other side of that fear, whatever truth emerges when you finally allow yourself to investigate honestly, it will be worth it. Because the truth, whatever it is always better than a comfortable lie. And freedom, real freedom, the kind that comes from thinking for yourself and living with integrity, is worth any cost. Even, and perhaps especially, the cost of letting go of everything you thought you knew. This is my story. It's not unique. There are thousands like me who woke up too late, who realized too slowly, who sacrificed too much before they learned to see clearly. But it's never too late to choose truth. It's never too late to choose love. It's never too late to come home to yourself, to your values, to the people who matter most. 70 years was too long. But at least I finally got there. And for that, I have my daughters to thank.